Hello and welcome everybody to the Set 4 Disney Lorcana meta report for the store championships. They're happening in the month of July. Over every weekend in July there's going to be events going on. I'm going to try and attend one every single weekend, although not including this weekend because I'm going to be attending the Disney Lorcana Challenge in Bochum. So make sure you check out the Disney Lorcana Twitch page because I'm going to be part of the broadcast team for that event and I'm so excited. There's also therefore on Monday going to be quite a lot to unpack. The decks which do very well this weekend in Bochum are very likely to be particularly popular for the rest of the store championship. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't see that update video on what the meta's looking like after this weekend. I also want to take this opportunity to give a quick shout out to the Disney Lorcana Fest, which is happening in Milton Keynes, England. I'm going to be attending both days. On the Saturday, there's some really fun on-demand events, which are going to be a different, more exciting and casual way of playing Lorcana. And then on the Sunday, we've got what I'm particularly looking forward to, the Super Store Championship, which is a huge version of a store championship where the top 4 are still getting the Ursulas, the top 2 still get the player mats, but the first and second place in the tournament get a whole case, 4 boxes of the first chapter, which is so difficult to get your hands on right now. The semi-finalists get a sealed booster box of either Rise of the Floodborn, Into the Incans, or Ursula's Return, and the quarter-finalists get 2 booster boxes of their choice as well, which is just super, super awesome prizing. Definitely recommend you checking out Disney Lorcana Fest. I'll be there. The first deck we're going to look at is an Amber and Emerald deck, and I think this one is a really interesting approach. It's definitely a pretty difficult deck to play, but it's also somewhat of a dark horse. I will say this is one of the lists in the video which I think there's some room for experimentation on. Mainly it's about finding that balance between having a lot of songs for Ariel, having enough discard tools to really feed your Prince John and ensure that you're discarding your opponent's hand quite aggressively, as well as making sure you have enough questing power. Without the Merfolk and Flynn Rider, which a lot of people don't play in this deck, the deck really doesn't have many aggressive questers, and you can have a great explosive start, but then just not have the questing power to cross the line. The other thing I've tried with this deck a lot is playing this deck without the Diablo, but I have to say the Diablo really does make a difference in this one. Being able to shift in Diablo and sing the Bare Necessities is a pretty devastating combo that Emerald and Amber has access to. If your opponent's holding on to a Baboom, ready to get rid of your Diablo, well, suddenly you can discard it with the Bare Necessities, and therefore you're going to be posing your opponent a lot of problems because they're suddenly not going to be able to answer these Diablos as easily. You've got Ariel, which can of course sing We Don't Talk About Bruno and as well contribute towards Under the Sea. And that's the other great thing about Diablo in this deck. If you've got the 1-cost Diablo down on the board alongside an Ariel, you are threatening to be able to shift in that Diablo and then exert Diablo and Ariel to sing Under the Sea. Without that Diablo, it can be pretty tricky to sing Under the Sea consistently because your opponent is often able to remove your threats. And with that Diablo, you're just overloading their removal options. You've got some other really nice cards in here. The Muses is great in this one, particularly when combined with Painting the Roses Red, which draws you a card, and up to 2 chosen characters get -1 strength, so you can bounce back a lot of cards into your opponent's hand. Another thing to look out with this one is utilizing the Muses on your own card. You could quest or sing with Ariel, bouncing her back into hand, replaying her to draw another powerful song card. Currently only at 18 songs, if I'm honest. I would like to increase that slightly, but it is really difficult finding that balance between the songs, the questing power, and the discard options as well. Overall, I do like the look of this deck quite a bit. It's certainly not one of the favourites, but I do think it's a bit of a dark horse, which could be showing up quite strongly. I think it could have a pretty strong performance in Bochum this weekend. I would imagine at least 1 or 2 decks creep into the top 64, and if the players know what they're doing, it could end up having a really strong run. Definitely a deck I would recommend if you're looking to play something a little bit unorthodox and you have access to those Diablos. Up next we have Ruby Amethyst, which I have to say, I've been a little bit of a Ruby Amethyst hater in my time of being a Disney Lorcana content creator. At the start of set 3, I said that the deck was dead. At the start of set 4, I said, okay, but now the deck really is dead. And now, honestly, I don't think I've ever liked Ruby Amethyst more than I do like the look of it right now. If I was playing in Bochum this weekend, there's a very strong chance I was going to be trying to cook up a slightly different Ruby Amethyst deck. This is kind of the most cookie cutter version of the deck that I would suggest. There are definitely a couple of cards in here which you might be missing. In particular, I'm not playing any copies of the 2-cost Kuzco or the 3-cost Maleficent. Just cards I'm not a very big fan of. I find them to be too slow. The Kuzcos are quite good with the crabs, and there's not really the space for the crabs in this metagame. And similarly, the Maleficent is good to sing friends, but you've got other cards which can sing friends, things like Maui, the Merlins, as well as the Fox. For me, the Magic Brooms and the Chernobyls are an absolute must in this deck. Ruby Amethyst is really looking to be quite aggressive in the current meta, but the real reason I love this deck so much is I just look at this deck and there is not a single bad card. I think all of these cards are incredibly strong. On one, you've got the Chernobyls and the Brooms, which for me are the best 1-cost cards in the game. That ability to quest and then draw at your leisure is so powerful, especially considering that they are inkable options. Honestly, I'm pretty interested in the option of trying a couple of 1-cost Maleficents in this deck as well. If you're looking to make your matchups better into those slower Ruby Sapphire decks, for example, then a couple of Maleficents could really do you well, particularly when you've got the bounce package. You've seen from my Amethyst Steel deck the power that those 1-cost Maleficents can have, even when going second if you have a snake on turn 2. And I do think it's really important for this deck to find a consistent curve. If you do miss those 1-drops, you're very much relying on finding that Flynn Rider on turn 2, because otherwise that Madam Mim snake is not going to be able to be played either. So I think there's a strong argument to go up to 10 1-drops, maybe even 11 with this deck. I do see quite a lot of the competitive versions only playing the Chernobyls followers, and I think to not play the Magic Brooms is a huge disservice to how powerful this card is. It's thinning your deck, gaining you lore, and it's just increasing the odds of you finding your other cards you're looking for, like friends on the other side. I just think these 1-drops are so amazing. Of course, you've got the Flynn Rider plus Sisu and Bolden Warrior. Synergy as well. The Flynn comes through on 2, and then the Sisu can often have 7 to 8 strength on turn 3 and be very difficult to deal with. An absolute powerhouse of a card. Of course, Flynn Rider does suffer a little bit from the fact that so many players have 2 damage removal due to Diablo, but even then, if your opponent doesn't have the answer and your Flynn Rider starts getting some value, he gets out of hand very quickly. One thing I particularly love about Ruby Amethyst now is their ability to sing Bee King Undisputed with Merlin Goat and Merlin Rabbit. I see a lot of players only playing 3 copies of this card, but I would strongly recommend to play 4. Similarly, it's kind of comparable to And Then Along Came Zeus in Amethyst Steel, but I think that Bee King Undisputed is just so much better. You can combo it with Brawl to remove so many targets in the early game. Being able to sing this the same turn you're removing characters with challenges or other actions or cards like Medusa is so powerful. And then of course we've got the Queen's Castle. I think Queen's Castle with the rabbits, the goats, and the Bee King Undisputed is where this deck really shines and comes into its own. Castle's so strong in this meta because there's quite a lot of B preps at the moment, and Maui just not able to clean up the Queen's Castle in a single swoop. Sapphire Steel struggles to deal with Queen's Castle, often needing to take in cards like Rise of the Titans and Avalanche. And even if they remove your Queen's Castle with Rise of the Titans or Avalanche, there's a chance that you could just play a second Queen's Castle, and then it's very unlikely they have that second copy of location removal. There are 4 Be Prepareds. The 4 Be Prepareds are in the deck because this deck's game plan against Bucky, while it's not a super favourable matchup, its main line is to try and not play any cards early in the game which don't draw, so not playing things like Flynn Rider, and instead just skipping the turn, maybe on turn 3, playing friends on the other side for 3 ink, and then just getting to that 7 ink mark to try and find a Be Prepared. Of course, Be Prepareds can be discarded by the Emerald Steel's Ursula Deceiver, but if you top deck that Be Prepared at the right moment, that is your main line in the matchup against the Bucky deck, so that's why there's 4 copies of it. I do personally think a very interesting approach would be to reduce the counts of Be Prepareds, maybe even entirely, and go very heavy on cards like Lady Tremaine, Madame Medusa, and increase the questing power for this deck with cards like Maleficent as well as the Super Goof. So overall, bringing the deck to have a lower curve, most likely it is going to make your Diablo Bucky matchup even worse. However, you are increasing your odds of getting those consistent victories against decks like Ruby Sapphire, regardless of the coin flip with some extra questing power. I do think it's something that you guys could experiment with. And as I say, if I was playing in Bochum this weekend, I definitely wanted to spend some considerable time testing a version of this deck which is a little bit more aggressive. This has great matchups into the big four decks, not including Bucky. So the Bucky deck obviously is not a great matchup, but it is winnable. Of course, the mirrors are mirrors, but then it's got very strong matchups into the Sapphire Steel deck, as well as that other deck which is in the top 4, which is Ruby Sapphire, because it struggles to deal with Queen's Castle. So, as arguably the biggest Ruby Amethyst hater in the history of Lorcana, where am I going to put it? Am I going to still put it in the A tier, slightly below the other decks? Honestly, I think it's earned its place in the S tier. It has found the lines which it can now beat the Diablo decks, so it's not just an auto loss against those decks anymore. Previously, I had it in the A tier because I just thought it was a completely unwinnable matchup in many ways, but it's proven to be a pretty solid matchup, and it has particularly strong matchups into the other decks, which I'm going to be putting into the S tier. So Ruby Amethyst, definitely a great deck, and again, I think it's worth experimenting with a more aggressive take on this deck. Well, here's a deck you probably didn't see entering the meta report, but I do think it deserves its place. I have a video coming on this deck pretty soon. I recorded some games actually against Reese, who finished second in Lille, and I was playing this deck, he was playing some meta stuff, and I was pretty impressed. Big shout out to Tau Man Purple, who popularized this kind of deck and got a pretty good record with it at, I think it was a 1k, they finished in the top 8. I have made some tweaks, but the overall theme of the deck is to use just in time on turn 3 into Jim Hawkins, which then plays the RLS Legacy, and then Jim Hawkins can move there for free. He will then get Evasive, which gives you a great way of dealing, for example, with Diablo. But obviously you're dumping a whole bunch of cards from your hand at once there, so you do rely pretty heavily on the card draw of Rapunzel. There are also some backup card draw options of Queen of Hearts, as well as Hades, as well as also utilizing the Underworld location. Whenever a character quests while here, you may pay 3 to add a character card from your discard to your hand. This deck's very interesting. I do think it has some serious potential, but it did in my testing just seem to be a little bit too inconsistent for my taste. But it is a really very fun deck. I like it a lot, and I did want to give it an honorable mention. The main flex slots in this one are the Beast Wounded, the Super Goofs, the Hercules, as well as you might want to consider playing no copy of Agrabah, but playing something like a Pride Lands instead. I went for the Beast Wounded just to have some more consistent options of card draw with Rapunzel, because Mother Gothel is often very easily removed, and I do like the look of Hercules quite a bit as a extra option to sing just in time and just get a lot of board control while protecting your locations. This deck does need to win quite quickly in my experience, and therefore the Flynn as well as the Super Goof can be nice options. A very, very fun deck. One of my favourite lists I've seen this set. Big shout out to Townman Purple, but where am I going to place it on the meta report tier list? So as much as I love this deck, I do think it's the weakest on the list, but honestly, it's a huge sign of respect to Talman Purple and his deck building that it even made the cut on the meta report. But I am going to put it in the D tier. Definitely one to play around with and have some fun with, but I would probably avoid playing it for your store championships. I don't think it's quite consistent enough, but you never know. Maybe you could take it for a spin. You could play around with some of the cards in the deck, and it might prove to be a deck which you really enjoy playing, and therefore it's definitely not the worst idea to give it a try and see if you enjoy it and see if you want to play it. There's worse decks out there, that's for sure, but I wouldn't really recommend it unless you're just wanting to really try and put your opponent out of their comfort zone. Amber Steel Songs next, and this list is based quite loosely but pretty close to, well, it's almost exactly the same as to what Zach Bivens played in Chicago. Zach Bivens had the best record in Chicago in Swiss, and I think they got knocked out in the top 32 or the top 16. In fact, I think it was the top 32. They finished 17th overall because they were the highest seed in Swiss. So it had a very good performance that weekend, only losing one best of 3 to get knocked out in the top cut. And a big problem that Amber Steel has had in the past is that it's got a pretty tricky matchup into Ruby Sapphire. The popularity of Ruby Sapphire has decreased due to it having a pretty bad matchup into Ruby Amethyst. And therefore, it does seem like a pretty good time for Amber Steel Songs, which has a very good matchup into Diablo decks with your ability to remove it with Grab Your Sword. Of course, you could consider an option where you play Giant Tinkerbell, maybe even the tiny Tinkerbell Tactician, and then you've got that shift on turn 4 option as well to help deal with the Diablo decks. But it's definitely a pretty interesting option to bring. World's Greatest Criminal Mind is also very strong against these Ruby decks, but also quite good against Sapphire, being able to hit Tamatoa. So World's Greatest Criminal Mind's looking pretty good. And the CP's Flute, as well as Pride Lands, is really aimed at just increasing your possibility of still beating Ruby Sapphire, which is, of course, still a pretty popular deck. I've got 3 copies of Cinderella in here. I think Zach only had 2 copies, and I perhaps removed a copy of Zeus. I think, in fact, no, Zach was playing Ursula Vanessa, which is this 2-cost character. I just think that the Cinderella is significantly better. 11 1-drop seems like a nicer number. I'm not really the hugest fan on Ursula Vanessa. I don't think there's a huge difference between being Singer 4 and Singer 1. And of course, Cinderella can come down that turn earlier. So I did remove the Vanessas. They are an option because they can sing Zeus. But I think that Cinderella is better, as I mentioned. But yeah, I actually think this deck is another dark horse somehow for this weekend. There's also the option of increasing the questing power with this deck. Instead of going like Pride Land, CP's Flute, you could play Piglet Pooh Pirate Captain in this 2-cost slot as well to speed it up. But I do think this deck could also be another one which catches some people off guard. I think it could prove to have a pretty good showing this weekend at Bochum. I don't expect it to have a massively high representation, but I could see it even winning the whole event. The songs deck, I'm torn between the A tier and the B tier. I'm leaning honestly more towards the B tier. I do also think Lemon Lime is a very solid deck as well, but I think that the songs could end up proving me wrong and going into the A tier. Both the songs and the Lemon and Lime deck are kind of my 2 dark horse options for the tournaments going into this first weekend of Set Champs. Okay, up next, a deck I'm sure you guys know quite well from my channel because it is a Speci special. This is my Ursula Returns content creator, Set Championships tournament winner with a record of an undefeated run in that tournament. It's a very, very good deck. It's just got a very flexible game plan. My main advice on if you're planning on playing this deck is just be very secure in what you're doing with each matchup. A lot of the matchups across the board are pretty tight, close to 50% on almost every meta deck. Of course, some matchups you can improve by adjusting some tech cards. For example, these Maleficents really helped my matchup into Ruby Sapphire, but the lack of Smash is potentially a problem when I'm playing against these Diablo decks to beat that as consistently as I might like. So if my local tournament, I was expecting lots of Diablo decks, I might consider removing the Spellbook, for example, removing a copy of Benja, maybe dropping the Maleficents down to 2 copies and playing 3 copies of Smash. I think Smash is the main card missing from this deck, which I would like to play to improve that matchup into the Diablo decks a little bit. But overall, a very, very fun deck. One which, if you're confident at outplaying your opponent, is a great option because, again, it just doesn't have any auto-loss matchups. I do think it is slightly weaker than the decks in the top 4, and it is still a little bit unproven, so I think it would be quite outrageous for me to put it in the S tier. And honestly, I don't think it is quite as good as the 4 decks which are going to be above it. However, it is a great deck, and I think it could win Bochum this weekend, and if it does win Bochum, expect it to be pretty much everywhere at your Set Champs. So yeah, the mid-range Amethyst Steel deck, and it's called mid-range because it can basically do a little bit of everything. It's not aggro, it's not control, it's very much somewhere in between. I'm putting it into the A tier. And up next, we have Tempo, which is going to be Emerald and Amethyst. So I have to say, out of all the decks in this list, this is probably the list which I have got the least experience with. I just haven't really loved the look of the color combination when compared with some of the other options, but I do think it's very, very strong. It had a great showing in Chicago, making it to the finals, And there's definitely some very interesting options for this deck. But when I wanted to mention that I haven't really tested the deck that much myself, so it's quite possible that there's going to be a few changes which would make it a more optimal list. I did spend a long time thinking about what cards to go for here. So one thing I love about Emerald Amethyst is the wide selection of very powerful one-cost cards. There's also the potential to make this an even more aggressive deck with cards like Maleficent and Befuddle, but I went for the 4 Churnabogs and 4 Brooms, as well as 4 Merfolk, bringing us up to 12 1-drops, which is of course a lot, but I do think this deck wants to be pretty heavy on the 1-drops. You really want to be finding your turn 1 play at all costs. This deck is having to go under Bucky Diablo, whereas most decks just try to control the board. You're basically trying to race against that deck. You have, of course, the bounce package with the snake, the goat, the rabbit, as well as the fox and friends on the other side. I did also include a couple copies of Mother Knows Best. I do think it's possible you could even play more copies of Mother Knows Best, being able to bounce back a Diablo with Kit Cloud Kicker and then sing friends on the other side or Mother Knows Best does look really strong in this meta. You also might be surprised by the lack of Diablo in this deck, but I really don't think this deck actually wants the Diablo. I mean, sure, if you've got it, you could play it. It's never going to be bad, but I really doubt that you would want the shift 1-cost Diablo in this one. You could just play the 3-cost Diablo, because why not? I just really personally wouldn't. I think if you're looking for an Emerald deck which doesn't play Diablo, this is probably the one for you. I did try, like I say, Amber Emerald without Diablo, and I was pretty unimpressed. But I think with all the card draw available that you have in Amethyst Emerald, it's really not necessary. And it really does want to be a bit more of an aggressive deck than Diablo is enabling. You've got Cricky, which I think is a really interesting card on 5, as well as Isabella Madrigal. They can both sing We Don't Talk About Bruno. It's possible you don't even want to play We Don't Talk About Bruno in this deck without access to Prince John, without access to cards like Ariel and more consistent singers and more discard options. It just might not be quite as valuable as it is in other decks. And again, I think Mother Knows Best might be a more interesting option there. The Ursula Sea Witch Queen is an absolute powerhouse. Of course, wanting to shift it onto that Ursula Deceiver, it is exerting so much questing pressure, as well as just being a bit of a menace, being able to exert cards. Shifting it in on turn 5 is such a powerful, powerful tool. And you might even want to increase the count of Ursula Sea Witch Queen up to 3. Tinkerbell Most Helpful is also a great option at consistently dealing with Diablo, because it's giving one of your other characters evasive for this turn. So things like your snake, your fox, and your rabbit and goat are very clean ways of dealing with Diablo with the Tinkerbell. So there's definitely a little bit of room for experimentation. I would strongly recommend having a pretty low curve for this deck. You could look at building it even more aggressively. You could even look at bringing Prince John and bringing back Prince John's Purple Dream. Could look at bringing in Diablo as well. More Mother Knows Best. I think the deck's got potential. If it's a color combination which you enjoy, definitely would recommend going for it. Again, it's going to be a little bit unorthodox, but I can't quite yet give it my specie seal of approval, simply because it's the main deck in this list, which I haven't yet tested extensively myself. But again, it did make the finals in Chicago, so it's definitely a solid deck, and potentially a dark horse which could have a very good performance this weekend. So my gut feeling with the Emerald Amethyst deck is that it's not quite up to the same level as the Song and the Under the Sea deck. Again, I could be wrong on this one. Just kind of my intuition tells me it's not quite the meta for this type of deck, but I do think that Kit Cloud Kicker could prove me wrong and be a bit of a money card. I think this is possibly the most controversial take that I have, putting this deck into the C tier, but I really do like the look of the Songs and the Under the Sea deck a lot more than I do this Emerald and Amethyst deck. But having said all that, Queen's Castle is so strong. Kit Cloud Kicker looks great against Diablo. You could definitely make it work. And this is the one I'm most unhappy with putting it down here. I want to put it higher, but I think it's probably a fair assessment, if not a little bit controversial. Okay then, up next we have Sapphire and Steel. This is one of the most difficult decks to build because there's a bunch of different ways you can go about it. You've got one version which doesn't play a whole new world, one version which does, and then you've also kind of got the big decision between Mickey Mouse or one jump ahead. I do think the Mickey Mouse is a much better option in the current metagame, and that's because Sapphire Steel has quite a tricky matchup into Ruby Amethyst, but this Mickey Mouse helps you play around Bee King Undisputed and also Tremaine quite efficiently. The main way you lose the matchups as a Sapphire Steel player against Ruby Amethyst is if you have an aerial on an open board, for example, and then a Tremaine or Bee King comes through and cleans it out. So that Mickey Mouse does make things a little bit more difficult for those decks to deal with. But because of the problem that Queen's Castle can provide to this deck, we've got 2 copies of Rise of the Titans and 2 copies of Avalanche, which is a lot of location removal, but this Rise of the Titans is also going to be doubling up potentially as item removal up against Lucky Dime players, for example, which can be quite useful. The Avalanche is particularly strong against those Diablo players. Being able to remove the Pirate's Cove and Bucky in a single swoop can be really devastating. And obviously that's really what this deck is looking to do, is just looking to control the board in the early game. And then a lot of other lists you might see will only be playing 2 copies of Aerial, maybe 3 copies of Tamatoa, whereas I've just gone all out with 4 Aerials, 4 Tamatoas, because really what I think this deck wants to do is control the early game board as much as possible while ramping, and then just have this explosive threaten of 10 lore in a single turn with Aerial plus Lucky Dime. Aerial, of course, with Ward, cannot really be removed by Sisu, the 8-cost Sisu in Ruby. Really the main way of dealing with her is those Bee Kings and Tremaines. So definitely looking to take some turns where you don't quest with Smee when you might want to, for example, to just make sure that Aerial stays protected from those threats. Overall, I think this deck's very good. You can play a non-Whole New World version, and I will include a version of no Whole New World in the description. Personally, I'm not really a believer. I think just play the Whole New World. It really helps you dig for what you're needing. If you're really needing that location removal at that moment in time, you can really dig for it. And I think as long as if you're not playing the Whole New Worlds, this location removal becomes even more clunky. You could definitely do it. I personally wouldn't recommend it. I think Whole New World's got to be the way to go. And Sapphire Steel would be the best deck in the game, in my opinion, if it wasn't for a very tricky matchup into Ruby Amethyst. So it's definitely a very good deck. But Ruby Amethyst popularity has stopped this really from being a deck which I would gravitate to as much as I would have before Ruby Amethyst became more popular in the set. This was my favorite deck about a month ago in the set, but yeah, there was not much Ruby Amethyst around at that time. I do think Sapphire Steel is great. I'm going to put it in the S tier. I'm actually going to put it above Ruby Amethyst. I think that it is definitely a contender to be winning the event this weekend and is without doubt one of the best 4 decks in the game. Ruby and Sapphire up next, a deck which has decreased in popularity significantly due to the popularity of Ruby Amethyst. It does have a very tricky matchup into Ruby Amethyst, and this current list, which I'm sharing with you, isn't teched particularly to improve that Ruby Amethyst. So you could try and improve your Ruby Amethyst matchup maybe by including some copies of the 3-cost Uninkable Sisu, which you can combine with Ice Block to remove that early Flynn Rider. You could also try the Vitalisphere to give your characters rush, maybe a Scar as an option of removing Queen's Castle. So you can try and tech this deck a little bit to increase your win rate against Ruby Amethyst, but it is also going to make you suffer in some other matchups. You can certainly play around with the count of Ice Block, Be Prepared, Sisu, and Lady Tremaine. No copy of Lady Tremaine in this one, but she's a great option. Overall, the deck is very, very good. Of course, prone to aggro, but also with Ruby Amethyst being more popular, it is struggling a little bit more than it otherwise was. The Bucky matchup is pretty good as well, but it does, and while it's favored for Ruby Amethyst, while the Bucky matchup is favored for Ruby Sapphire, it's definitely not a super winning matchup all of the time. Overall, I'm not super high up on Ruby Sapphire right now. I personally wouldn't play it if I was playing in the store championships. Having said that, it's also important to bear in mind that this Ruby Sapphire deck has never really been my cup of tea, and I don't think there's much separating the top 4 decks at all, and you could really put them in any order. But personally, I do think that the Ruby Sapphire deck is struggling the most into the metagame compared with the other decks in the top 4. Finally, it's everybody's favorite deck. It's Emerald Steel discard. This list is the Rats who won Chicago. I do like the list. The one thing I don't particularly like about the deck is the copy of Zeus, but Zeus can, of course, help you a little bit against locations, potentially, which can be a weakness of this deck. It's just really good. You guys know all about Diablo. There's not that many decks, really, which beat it consistently. But if you are looking to beat this deck, definitely take a look at the Under the Sea deck as well as the Amber Steel Song deck. Personally, I would never go near this deck. I think it's a bit gross. I think it's quite boring to play, and it's very expensive. So it's my least favorite deck in the format, but it's still very good. And of course, if you're looking to secure some Ursulas, you really can't go wrong with this deck. It's very, very powerful, especially when piloted by a strong player. I don't want to do it, but I'm going to put the Diablo Bucky deck as the number 1 deck. Now, I still don't think that this deck will be winning the Bochum event this weekend. I made that prediction before Chicago that it wouldn't win, and it did. I'm going to make the same prediction that it won't win Bochum. I think that there's going to be quite a lot of decks like Songs and Lemon and Lime, which are really built to deal with this Bucky deck more consistently. And I think if you're really playing a deck which doesn't beat Bucky, why are you playing the deck is kind of my way of looking at the meta, which is perhaps why I've put this Emerald Amethyst deck lower, although it could. I don't know the matchup particularly well. But I do think for store championships in particular, it's just a very, very good pick. I really do. Of course, you've just got a smaller player pool than you do at a Disney Lorcana Challenge event. And it's just a deck which, if you're not that good at the game, is not that difficult to play. Don't get me wrong. There's definitely some very high skill things you can do with Bucky. But if you're not great at the game and you've got the cards, it's kind of hard to go wrong too much. Play Bucky on 2 and pray it doesn't get removed. And that is actually, you're just going to win a lot of games with this deck. So I am going to put Bucky as my top pick, regrettably, for the set championships. But do bear in mind that if you're at a more competitive store, there's going to be a lot of players with decks built specifically to beat Bucky. Decks like the Amber Steel Songs, the Lemon Lime. And also, I really want you to keep an eye on what happens at the Bochum event this weekend, because I do think the results of Bochum are going to heavily dictate what decks are more popular this for the rest of the set champs. For example, if an Amber Steel Song deck is victorious in Bochum, then suddenly Bucky doesn't seem like quite as much of a good pick, because Amber Steel Song's popularity is going to go through the roof. And that's going to be a really tricky matchup for the Emerald Steel player. So that is my meta report. I do also want to give some honorable mentions to a few other decks I didn't include. Jafar. I think Jafar could be pretty good. I think Amber Amethyst has some potential. I think Hyper Aggro is always worth a consideration as well. There's lots of... And Ruby Emerald as well. I think Ruby Emerald's got potential. So I still think there's a lot of stuff to play around with. Don't be afraid to play something unorthodox and have fun. Best of luck, guys. Let me know if you agree with my tier list, and make sure you stay tuned for Monday when I'm going to be having that post-Bochum deck video. See you soon. Cheers.